Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor C.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with neuroscientist and philosopher Adina Roskies about what we can learn about free will from monkey cognition. We also ask her about her take on the Libet experiment and whether neuroscience could, in principle, disprove free will.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Adina Roskies, who's the Hellman Family Distinguished Professor at Dartmouth College, Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Cognitive Science Program at Dartmouth, and affiliate faculty in Psychological and Brain Sciences. Adina has PhDs in both neuroscience and philosophy, and she publishes in both disciplines. She's been interviewed for Closer to Truth, and she's an investigator in the Neurophilosophy of Free Will project that we've talked about in earlier episodes on this podcast. Well, welcome to the show, Adina. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So my trajectory was sort of a big spiral. I actually didn't start at all in cognitive science. I started in physics and then ended up doing humanities. And then toward the end of my college career, I just landed in, I read Gödel, Escher, Bach, and that really sparked my interest. And I ended up taking a seminar that I had no qualifications to take, but it really changed my life. And I really fell in love with both philosophy and neuroscience, and I didn't really know what to do. And I still feel like that's true. I just keep going back and forth between the two of them, and ended up getting 2 PhDs. But the free will story is it was kind of by chance. As a neuroscientist, I kept seeing these really philosophically naive statements from neuroscientists about how they can disprove or have disproved free will. And I just got madder and madder. And one day I'd never written on the subject, but I sat down and wrote this paper that appeared in Ticks on why neuroscience can't answer the question of determinism. And kind of viewed it as a one-off thing, but it just started the ball rolling. And then once you start working in an area, you just end up getting called upon to keep working in that area. Right. And so it's really turned into one of the main things I do, but it was, pretty much fortuitous. It was not at all planned.
Yeah. Right.
Nice.
Well, we've already dedicated an entire episode to the Libet experiment, and we've also asked other neuroscientists that we've interviewed about their take on it, on his experiments. So we can be brief here. But would you like to give your assessment of the Libet experiment and maybe say a little bit about your recent work with Aaron Sugar?
Yeah. So I think the Libet experiment has just been widely misinterpreted both by Libet and by lots of other people. What Libet found is definitely, an effect, a finding that there is brain activity before you report being aware of having made a decision. I think just on its face, there's nothing particularly threatening to free will about that. I mean, unless you are a dualist and you think that the brain does not cause in some way consciousness, you would expect there to be brain activity that is related to and preceding consciousness of anything. So the second thing that I think is a misinterpretation of the Libet experiment is that what Libet measures is not the timing of conscious awareness, but the timing of awareness of conscious awareness of a decision. So it's a metacognitive state, which you would expect to follow the presence of the state that it's about. So that's another reason to not take very seriously the way people have interpreted the findings. And then finally, the work that Aaron Sugar and others have done about decision processes in the brain shows that you can explain the physiological finding of the Libet experiment, that is the existence of a readiness potential, just in terms of the operation of the kind of decision processes that you would expect to be involved in making the kinds of decisions that Libet's paradigm asks you to make. So for all of those reasons, I think that there's reason to be really skeptical about the way in which those experiments have been interpreted to bear on the problem of free will.
Yeah.
Nice. Do you want to say anything about the recent work with Aaron Scherger on readiness potential in particular?
Yeah, so Aaron's insight was essentially that decision processes as modeled by like diffusion to bound or accumulator mechanisms. If you hypothesize that those processes are active in the kind of paradigm that Libet has you do, which is, basically deciding to move your finger, then because of the way that the Libet studies are analyzed, where you time lock to the actions, you would expect to see a readiness potential as just a mathematical certainty given the nature of those practices. So it gives you a very clear explanation of why you see a ready potential that doesn't allow you to interpret it as, your brain having decided before you do. What it tells you is that the brain's decision processes take time and have a certain kind of form that will look like a readiness potential when analyzed in a particular way. The other insight that I think, so Aaron and I wrote a recent paper also in Trends in Cognitive Sciences. The way that we sort of evaluate the ways in which people have interpreted these studies as being either early decision models or late decision models, I think sort of clarifies what the misunderstanding probably is, right? So if you think that decisions happen later than these processes, that is, that the process is leading up to a decision and not marking the beginning of it, doesn't mark the beginning or the existence of a decision, then there's a very different way of interpreting those kinds of data. So that's basically the idea of the paper that we wrote. It's more of a theoretical piece than anything that is showing new data about the Libet experiment.
Right. That's cool. Well, I wanted to ask a more general question that relates to something you said earlier about something you've written on, and that maybe got you into the free will spiral. And that's, do you think there could ever be neuroscientific evidence that would disprove free will?
I think there could be neuroscientific evidence that could contribute to, maybe arguments that free will is not operative in particular circumstances. So one kind of evidence, and when I say contribute to, I just mean that this kind of evidence, it doesn't wear its interpretation on its face. The neuroscience alone isn't going to get you to an argument, because the neuroscience has to be interpreted in psychological terms in order for it to really bear on that question. But suppose you had, for instance, good evidence that people make decisions that are essentially governed by stimuli that they are completely unaware of. And so that you can essentially control the decisions people make, even if those decisions go against, let's say, their best interests or their own avowed reasons, let's say, for preferring an alternative. And you can present unconscious stimuli that are so dominating that they cause people to make the other decision. That seems to me like it would be a good challenge to free will, but that's not a general challenge to free will. That's a challenge to free will in a specific circumstance.
Right.
Another kind of challenge is, I think, more dependent on a what general view you have of free will. So I tend to favor a capacitarian view that, in order to really be free, you have to have certain kinds of capacities. And we might someday learn enough about the brain to be able to identify when somebody has or lacks various capacities. So perhaps a certain kind of brain damage could extinguish somebody's capacity for, I don't know, deliberating about reasons or inhibiting certain kinds of actions or something like that. And then you might be able to say, this person lacks these capacities and therefore doesn't have free will or doesn't have, the same level of freedom as, a person who's unimpaired. So I think that that's another way in which neuroscience could be informative, but it depends on having a certain view about what it is to have free will, and then identifying the neural bases of those kinds of capacities.
Yeah, interesting. So we're calling this episode Monkeys and Free Will. We wanted to ask you specifically about your work on what we can learn about human agency and from monkey agency. And you've got a chapter in a book called Surrounding Free Will, edited by our previous guest, Al Mealy, called Monkey Decision Making as a Model System for Human Decision Making. So could you describe the experiments involving monkeys and the decision-making model based on those findings?
Yeah. So Mike Shadlin and Bill Newsom and a bunch of their colleagues pioneered experiments in monkeys where they designed perceptual decision tasks in which monkeys had to make decisions under uncertainty. So they basically gave them perceptual stimuli, added a bunch of noise so they could titrate how difficult those kinds of decisions were, and then ask them to decide, are these dots moving to the right or are they moving to the left? That's sort of the general overall framework in which these experiments are done. And what's, I think, really exciting about the experiments is that in contrast to at least most people, you can actually record from individual neurons while the monkeys are going through this decision process. So this is interesting for decision making only if you antecedently think that monkeys are doing something like humans do when humans make decisions. Now, there's lots of evidence that they are doing something similar. So if you do, let's say, psychometric functions, you can see that they're very similar. You can ask people to do the same task and give their own introspective reports about what's going on when they do those things. And so I think the monkey decision tasks are a good model of at least some decision tasks that humans do, but in contrast to with humans, where you can't ethically stick an electrode in their brain and figure out what's going on at the neural level, you can do that in monkeys. And so basically you can take the data from monkeys, and because there are so many similarities in brain structure and other kinds of functional similarities and evolutionary relationships between humans and monkeys, you can infer that similar processes are going on in humans. And so that's a way to try to understand what's going on in decision-making in humans. So then you might object, well, they're still monkeys, they're not humans, and what humans are doing are different. And so Shadlin and other neuroscientists who work in this kind of paradigm have started to manipulate various aspects of decision-making in that context that are similar to things we think are important in human decision-making. So you can manipulate, for instance, the value of the reward in the studies and see how that affects decision-making and see what the neural basis is for that. And you can manipulate the probability of being correct, and you can manipulate the difficulty of the task, or you can manipulate the number of options that the monkeys have in the task. And these are all things that you can do with people. And so they've basically shown that you can see the neural signatures of those kinds of considerations on decision making when you look at the monkeys, just like we are assuming that those kinds of factors also influence human decision making. And so ultimately, you're left with one big difference, which is that we have language and we can, reason explicitly about things. And that's, a harder objection to counter. But many of the things that we've already talked about, like value and probability, are encoded in ways that are influencing the monkey's decision and, can be represented propositionally as well. And so the thought is that, whether the format of the deliberation is propositional or non-propositional, we don't know what the case is in monkeys, but we can sort of build that bridge by saying, look, propositions are just another kind of evidence that feed into this kind of model. So, I'll be the first to admit that there is a difference between humans and monkeys, but I haven't seen an argument that convinces me that the underlying processes aren't the same, that our decision making is sort of built on these evolutionary foundations, and then it can be influenced by, later developments like development of language and propositional thought. And I still think it's really an open question whether, propositional thought is completely dependent on language or just sort of language is an elaboration of more basic ways of thinking about the world. And it seems to me that there are pretty good arguments for the latter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, you've already addressed this objection that there are important differences between human beings and monkeys. Are there any other common objections that you get to your work comparing monkey decision-making with human decision-making?
I think they all sort of boil down in some way to humans are not monkeys. But yeah, I think you sort of need more. So people will say things like, well, yeah, but humans are conscious. But there's no reason to think that monkeys aren't conscious. And there's, the one thing that we can say is that monkeys don't have language in the way that humans have language. And certainly that will keep monkeys from thinking certain kinds of thoughts. But I think it's pretty clear that monkeys have lots of thoughts.
Yeah.
And so they may have a much more restricted capacity. If you're having if you take a capacitarian approach to free will, you might say, okay, well, monkeys don't have the degree of freedom that humans have because maybe they don't have the ability to do a certain kind of deliberation. And I think it's clear that, they're not, we don't hold them morally responsible, right? Because they don't have those kinds of capacities. So if you want to think of full-blown free will as the kind of thing that underlies moral responsibilities, well, monkeys don't have that, but they can certainly act autonomously and make decisions that are, in their own interest or even not in their own interest if they, want to do something altruistic so I just think that, there certainly will be more to be said about human decision making. But as a basic framework for thinking about it, I think that the monkey data is really informative.
Yeah. I've been thinking about, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I've heard of some people compare the cognitive capacities to monkeys, or the cognitive capacities of monkeys to the cognitive capacities of a young child. How much truth is there in that? And does that show as children are developing, there is something limited about the capacities, if you're taking the capacitarian view, that we develop over time or something like that?
That's a great question. I don't really, I haven't sat down to try to sort of chart out monkey capacities relative to human capacities.
I guess
And
part of the
you know,
question will be is human decision making, like as we develop, different in kind or just in degree?
um, I guess I think it's different both in kind and
Yeah.
degree, and at some point, degree becomes a difference in kind, right? You know, the kind of moral responsibility I can attribute to my 8-year-old when he does something isn't the kind that I will be able to attribute to him when he's 20. Um, because his capacities, I hope, will be quite different at that point. Um, and you know, so I think, yeah, it's a matter of degree. I mean, he has the capacity to reason and he has grasp of language now, but it's not the same as it will be in another, 15, 20 years. And I think that leads to a difference in kind of, let's say, the type of responsibility that I attribute to him. Do I think that he lacks free will now? No. But I don't think that he has, sort of the degree of control and the ability to reflect on things and even the world knowledge that would be required to really be informed in one's choices to, sort of be on par with the freedom that he might have in the future. So
I can think of some adults that don't that don't meet those criteria either. So
that's right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's the capacitarian approach allows for, different individuals and maybe even the same individual in different circumstances to have different degrees of freedom. And I think part of the thought about how this might impact in, let's say, the legal arena is that, there are cases in which people's freedom is compromised because of lack of capacity and their responsibility is also diminished. Usually, for at least most normal people, they at least pass a certain threshold. And so you can hold them responsible for their actions. But there are cases in which people really may not have the capacities required to hold them responsible. So,
we've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but so from the data from the monkeys, how are those going to inform our discussions of free will? Like, what is our takeaway from these experiments with regards to free will?
Well, I think that the way in which I've been thinking about it has been with respect to the question of determinism. I don't think that determinism is the right thing to focus on when talking about freedom, but it happens to be what most people focus on. And the reason I was interested in the monkey decision making is because there are these trials that the monkeys are given in which there is actually no information, right? It's a trial in which you can't say that the decision is driven by the stimulus. So that's the sort of, lift your finger whenever you want thing, the spontaneous decision that has to be initiated by the agent. And then the question is like, what happens when there's no information? Do they always make the same choice? The answer is no. They make, approximately 50% choices to the right or the left. I mean, they don't know that there's no information. They're just trying to take their best guess. And then the question is, okay, so then does the fact that they make these different choices show that they have free will and they're not determined? Some people have argued that that's enough, but the truth is that you can look at the neural data and see that there are, correlations between underlying fluctuations and what they choose in those circumstances. And what I've argued is that you can keep looking at finer and finer grains and, interpret each of those levels as showing stochastic activity or deterministic activity. There's no bottom level in which neuroscience is going to give you the answer, because it goes all the way down to like the level of molecules.
Mm.
And so ultimately, I think if you think that determinism or indeterminism is the sort of key to answering the free will question, it's not going to come from neuroscience. It's going to come from our best physical theory. And currently, we have competing physical theories, different interpretations in which, the physical world is deterministic or indeterministic. So I just don't think, we're not there in physics, and I don't think that neuroscience is ever going to get us there. So that's why I think neuroscience isn't going to answer the question of free will posed as a question about are we determined or not.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think that what matters are capacities and not determinism, it can tell you a lot about the nature of capacities, right? So it's just a different lens to look at the problem through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do monkeys have a little bit of free will?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think my dog has free will, and I hold him responsible for certain things, right? He can decide whether or not to listen to me, and he can get rewarded or punished or whatever on the basis of whether he does that. But if he doesn't do my son's homework, I'm not going to punish him, right? He doesn't have that capacity.
Are there any other projects you're working on that you wouldn't mind previewing for us, for our audience?
Yeah. So I guess emanating from the free will project, I got interested in agency more generally. And so I am currently working on a project to try to describe agency in a sort of a data-driven way by looking at different populations that have different kinds of neuropsychiatric diseases, and to see whether there are sort of signatures of the kinds of capacities, deficits, et cetera, that can characterize these different diseases as a way of getting at a picture of what agency is in various guises. And so we have a big survey and a bunch of behavioral tasks that we're asking people to do in order to see sort of what the sort of general picture of agency is. And it turns out that it's actually very hard to do something that's purely data-driven, that's not, theoretically informed. I think actually impossible. And it relates to another thing that I'm really interested in, which is the question of cognitive ontology. Like, what are the sort of building blocks of cognition, or the metaphysical, elements of cognition? And there's this sort of, I think, philosophically deep and probably intractable problem about, sort of which comes first, the chicken or the egg.
Yeah.
Like, how do you figure out what the building blocks are without already imposing a theory? I think the more I do these things and struggle with them, the less convinced I am that there is sort of one single answer. It's more like a reflective equilibrium between theory and data. But I don't have anything really fully matured in that area yet. But those are issues that I'm thinking about a lot these days.
Very cool. So where do you predict that there's going to be interesting developments, or what areas of science do you think would be most fruitful for philosophers interested in free will to explore?
Well, I think the question of unconscious effects on decision making, and the more theoretical question of what kind of consciousness is important or relevant for free will, and why, is an interesting question that I don't think people have really answered sufficiently well. There's something that people have found very intuitively compelling about the way in which Libet addressed this, like the idea that you should have a conscious intention that somehow floats free of causal influences, I think that's a non-starter, but there is something about consciousness that seems important. I mean, we don't think that it's realistic to attribute free will to non-conscious objects, right? So creature consciousness seems like at least one requirement. And then you can ask, well, why? What is important about consciousness such that it's a necessary condition on free will? And then you can ask, but there are other things that you could be conscious of. So, you might need to be conscious of the reasons for your decision, or at least some reasons for your decision. But do you have to be conscious of all the reasons for your decision? Do you have to be conscious of all the causal factors of your decision? I mean, if we had to be conscious of all the causal factors, we would be not free ever.
Yeah.
And so then which ones, if there are some, or do you need to be conscious of having an intention, or do you have to be conscious of the outcome of your decision? And why do all of these different kinds of consciousness matter? I think those are really important questions, because there are all these social psychology effects that have been described. Some of them have been called into question, but I think that it's undoubtable that there are some unconscious effects on decision making. I think it's naive to think that if there are any, then we're not free. But I think that there's a lot to be said about, what kinds of effects would really threaten freedom, or what degree of effect would really threaten freedom. And, that's not yet fully explored. I mean, I've talked about, so the cognitive ontology stuff doesn't really map on very much. The agency stuff does, but I don't really have results to give at this point.
Right,
so, and then I think so. I'm just working right now on a paper on conscious effects on decision making with a bunch of people from that group, and it's sort of very high level. And it struck me that as we're writing that it's it has to be very short, and so we don't even have a chance to really delve into these questions about what kind of consciousness really matters. But I don't think that there's a really good account of that. I mean, I've written a little bit in the paper that you mentioned. I write a little bit about that, but I still think that a much more rigorous approach to that would be helpful.
Thanks so much for joining us, Adina. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Well, you can look at my website on the Dartmouth faculty pages, although I do not really keep that up to date. I think to really follow my work, I really need a PR agent, I guess. But to follow my work, I would just Google Roskies. There aren't too many of us, and there you go. And you can probably come up with my latest publications that way.
Cool.
Great.
Well, thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for asking me. This was really fun.
In our next episode, we'll turn from neuroscience to psychology, beginning with a discussion of willpower and ego depletion. Our guest will be Roy Baumeister, professor of psychology at the University of Queensland.